Today we'll talk about The Wind Rises. This is our plan for today. Chapter 1, Kikaida. 2, The Witch and the Prophet. 3, Bargaining with the Devil. 4, Against Osamu Tezuka. In the limited part, we'll cover Chapter 5, In Germany. 6, The Truth Behind His Retirement. 7, The Mysterious Final Scene. 8, Supplementary Lesson. We'll do a supplementary lesson just for the special members. So, we'll start from the beginning. I will speak slower than usual. It's no use talking fast. We talked about the Great Kanto earthquake last time. Jiro Horikoshi meets a guy named Honjo at Tokyo University. This character appears throughout the story. He's Jiro's best friend and also his rival. His role in the story is very important, like Jigen Daisuke in Lupin III. This character Honjo is based on a real-life figure with the unusual name of Kiro Honjo. Together with Jiro, who designed the bomber Mitsubishi G4M, he brought the Japanese aviation industry up to an international standard in the pre-war era. He was considered a genius. Honjo stood out even more in Hayao Miyazaki's first draft of The Wind Rises. This was going to be Miyazaki's first buddy film. Miyazaki wanted to write a story about two men who go on a journey together. Honjo's character originally corresponded to Jiminy Cricket. That's why it was a buddy film. So who is Jiminy Cricket? This is the first episode of Kikaida by Shotaro Ishinomori. The professor is determined to design a robot with a good heart. A robot who will never obey bad orders. So he creates a circuit of conscience. He says he'll name it Gemini. Why did he call this good-hearted robot Gemini, which means binary stars? Kikaida is based on Pinocchio. In the very last scene of the last episode, there's a line that goes, "Was Pinocchio really happy to become a human?" It is a story about a wooden doll who worked hard and tried desperately to acquire a human heart. Kikaida is based on the Disney version of Pinocchio. In the Disney version, Pinocchio was granted the right to become human by a goddess, but he can't distinguish between right and wrong. So Jiminy Cricket, who is actually a cricket, serves as his guide. Jiminy Cricket teaches the newly born Pinocchio, who doesn't know what's good and what's bad, what he can or can't do. Jiro is a genius, but although he knows the basics of right and wrong, he doesn't understand the complexities of good and evil. Jiro doesn't speak his mind. In fact, he hardly talks at all. So, in Miyazaki's first draft, he has Honjo asking Jiro, "Do you think this is right? Or does this make sense to you?" in order to uncover the causes of the war. Honjo was the Jiminy Cricket. And Jiro was depicted as an enigmatic man. Honjo was always the one asking Jiro questions and starting a heated debate, whereas Jiro was depicted as a man of few words, and he would assume that he was thinking his own thoughts. In other words, Jiro was the Nausicaa, and Honjo was the Kushana. Nausicaa's action is based on her simple sense of justice, while Kushana questions her on the feasibility of her plans. Kushana is realistic and says to Nausicaa that they might not be able to survive. That was his role. So Miyazaki had this buddy movie idea in his mind at an early stage. This is when Honjo appears for the first time. The library of Tokyo University is on fire as a result of the earthquake. The books are burning. He's working hard trying to save the books from the fire when he suddenly takes a break and sits down to smoke a cigarette. He can be erratic and impulsive. This is 2 years later in a canteen in Tokyo University. They're eating lunch. He scolds Jiro, who always orders mackerel, saying, "We are living in the Juralumin world. You should eat tofu and beef like the rest of us." Instead of saying, "Eat steak," he says, "Tofu and beef," because they were poor and that was all they could afford. Later on in the film, when Honjo actually sees the Junkers G38 covered with Juralumin, he freaks out. This scene is linked to that. Honjo always reminds Jiro what is happening in the world around them. He reflects society. That is his role. Jiro, on the other hand, is fascinated by the curved bone of the mackerel. He picks up the bone with his chopsticks and goes to his classroom to trace the bone. He places the bone underneath a paper and traces it with his pencil. He tracks the curve beautifully. Jiro is excited and says, "Honjo, check this out! You can find the same curve as this mackerel in the Naka model." At first I was confused when I saw this scene in the movie theater, but then I saw the storyboard and I finally understood. Naka stands for National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in the US. Naka is the predecessor of NASA. Until it became NASA in 1958, it was an institution for developing aviation technology. The most famous facility of Naka was the Langley Research Center. This center had a state-of-the-art wind tunnel. It could generate a wind with the speed of sound. The center sought to perfect the wings, surface, and shape of aircrafts. It also released monthly reports, and in them, Jiro finds a wing surface model that embodies the exact same curve as the mackerel bone. Jiro does the calculation himself, figuring out the bone's vertex and curvature. The model was the result of an experiment carried out in the wind tunnel. Later on, Naka became NASA, and the wind tunnel at the Langley Research Center became a supersonic speed wind tunnel. This was also used for Project Mercury. The wind tunnels that we see in films like The Right Stuff and Hidden Figures were both wind tunnels in Langley, so they are all connected. By the way, later in his life, Honjo develops the first high-speed wind tunnel in Japan. What a coincidence. And later in the film, we see a cool aircraft called Kyushi single-seat fighter plane. Honjo places the model of this plane in the wind tunnel designed by himself and calculates its maximum speed, which is 240 knots. But Jiro doesn't accept this result. He thinks it's unrealistic, so he submits his original data to the Navy. But when they actually fly the plane, it really reaches 240 knots. Then he knows that the wind tunnel designed by Honjo is credible and apologizes to him. The wind rose. In the very last scene, the Kyushi single-seat fighter plane flies at 240 knots, and Kurokawa says, "This can't be real!" So everything in this world is connected, and there's never a dull moment. So I hope you'll enjoy my lecture. After the mackerel incident, Jiro graduates from Tokyo University as the top student and is hired by a company making internal combustion engines, which is now the Mitsubishi Aircraft Corporation. He goes to Nagoya to make airplanes. During his journey, he notices people walking along the railroad track, a large crowd of people. But when a train approaches, they all run away. When Jiro asks Honjo who they are, he tells him that they are all on their way to the cities to look for work. So you see, Jiro basically knows nothing. He doesn't know what's going on in the world. Honjo is smarter, and he tells Jiro everything. Who are they? They are the unemployed. What are they doing? They're all going to the bank. Honjo is the Jiminy Cricket. Most citizens cannot afford to go on a train, so they walk for days to get to Nagoya. But the two take a taxi to work. The company pays. From the taxi, Jiro sees a swarm of people outside a bank trying to withdraw money. There is a bank run and everybody is rushing to the bank, but his eyes are as cold as glass, without expression. He watches a woman desperately trying to take out her money. He doesn't understand why all these people are so desperate. This is 2 years after the Great Kanto earthquake. The banks issued the draft for the companies to reconstruct their buildings, but many companies couldn't meet the repayment date, which was 2 years after the earthquake. The companies were optimistic at first, but ultimately they couldn't pay, and this is what triggered what we call the Great Showa Depression. The companies went bankrupt, one after another. Fearing default, people rushed to the banks to withdraw their funds, and the economy got even worse. Unlike the people on the streets, Jiro is very relaxed in his taxi. He stares blankly outside and says, "Oh, they look so desperate." I think this is the key note of this scene. If the government had done something to stimulate employment after the earthquake, this crisis might not have happened. But instead, the Japanese government was trying to expand its military power to invade other countries, and this was the result. So, Honjo knows that it is his duty to explain what is happening to Jiro. Honjo thinks that Japan is trying to be a leading country and that this hardship is necessary to make that leap. He wants to make Japan great by making airplanes. He believes that enhancing military strength will make Japan wealthy, but Jiro is not thinking about this. This dialogue reminds us of Jiminy Cricket. Honjo's character is necessary to highlight Jiro as a psychopath who is only interested in planes. Next. This storyboard might be a bit hard to see. Jiro is now working in Mitsubishi. He's constantly looking at girls. In the first frame, it says Jiro is unapologetic. Jiro was late for work and was scolded by Kurokawa. But Jiro doesn't seem to mind him at all and remains very calm. In the second frame, it says Jiro's eyes wander to the left. In the third frame, it says the girls pass by. Fifth frame, Jiro is bowing to the girls and also exchanging glances with another girl. Then he even nods to a girl passing on his left side. Kurokawa is Miyazaki's favorite character, and you can see that he is a person of integrity. whereas Jiro is barely listening to him and continues to glance at the girls. So clearly, Miyazaki is trying to distance him from the audience. He tells the audience, you see, he's not very impressive. Please be critical about him, by showing his faults. In a later scene where Kurokawa is talking to Jiro, Jiro can't take his eyes off the airplane. Jiro is more interested in girls and planes than in his colleagues, but he's a genius and he shows his huge ability in his work. Jiro is an uncooperative character. I use the word psychopath for Jiro, and Miyazaki doesn't like Jiro's psychopathic side. You can see that here. He never forgives Jiro, saying he's just a genius. There's another genius character, Honjo, who is not like Jiro. Miyazaki calls Jiro and Honjo the two geniuses in his essay. He doesn't accept Jiro's faults just because he's a genius. In fact, he wants to show the imperfections of Jiro Horikoshi in this film. I'll talk about his reasons for this in the second half. I talked about this scene in the trailer. He offers sweets to a girl, but she refuses. Jiro is shocked for a second. Jiro says to the girl, "Here, have some sweets. They're pretty nice." The girl looks at them, suppresses her hunger, and looks back at Jiro. Both siblings glance at the sweets, but in the next frame, the brother looks up at his sister, and she looks squarely at Jiro. Jiro doesn't understand why the girl refuses the sweets. They might be poor, but they have their pride. They don't feel good when a guy offers them food with a condescending attitude. But Jiro is so spoiled, he doesn't understand that. After this incident, Honjo visits Jiro's apartment. He abruptly walks into Jiro's apartment. We later find out that he has come to tell Jiro that he too is going to Germany, although Jiro, his rival, was chosen before him. He wants to tell Jiro that he too is chosen and brag about it, but Jiro looks very upset when he's serving tea. When Honjo asks, "What's wrong?" Jiro tells him about the sweets incident. Then Honjo says, "Well, you're a hypocrite. What did you expect? Did you think she'd be grateful and give you a big smile?" Jiro immediately answers, "No, that's not what I was thinking." But then he drops his head and says in a small voice, or maybe it is, he was truly embarrassed with himself. Although he was quick to deny it, he admits that he might have expected the pretty girl to thank him, and he is embarrassed. Honjo adds, a single one of those components that you develop for the Hayabusa plane could feed all the kids in the neighborhood. He goes on to explain that they themselves are the cause of the starvation. They are the reason why the kids are starving in the streets. And then Jiro goes, "Why is our country so poor?" They basically don't understand each other. Honjo is saying in essence, don't you understand that we are the perpetrators? Maybe it makes you feel good to offer sweets to the kids, but the sole reason why they're so poor in the first place is that we make airplanes and those airplanes eat money. That family cannot go back home because we are making planes out of government money. He says that's why the kids have to wait for their parents in the streets. He's stressing that we are the real perpetrators. He has to. He's the Jiminy Cricket. But Jiro is not aware that he is the perpetrator. Being poor is just a state, and he thinks that no one should be blamed for that. Honjo asks Jiro, "Have you any idea how much money the Japanese government is spending on the Junkers technology? It's enough to pay for a bowl of tempura rice plus some dessert for every girl in the country. You'd even get some change out of it." But Jiro barely responds to that. Honjo says, "But I can't waste this opportunity." And then Jiro gets excited and says, "Are you going to Germany too?" Jiro quickly reacts to Honjo's comment about missing a career opportunity. So Jiro might be a psychopath, but he's not a bad person at all. He's delighted at Honjo's good news, as if it's his own. But he basically has zero understanding of Honjo's dilemma. Before leaving, Honjo says, "Poor countries crave planes, and that's why we can make them. It doesn't make any sense." Jiro doesn't understand what Honjo has said. He tries to figure it out in his room, but Miyazaki doesn't show his troubled face. Miyazaki wants the audience to imagine what Jiro is thinking and what Jiro made of Honjo's comments. It makes us wonder where we stand ourselves. So Miyazaki is trying to be objective regarding Jiro, just like Isao Takahata. You'll see this type of objectivity pretty often in the first 30 minutes. It is completely different from his previous work. Now, I want to talk about something a bit complex. I'll talk about what happens to these two guys in Germany in the second half. I wanted to talk about this in the free part today. It's the scene near the end. Well, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago when I talked about The Wind Rises. I talked about Jiro's relationship with Nahoko and so forth. But now I see the film in a different light, so I'd like to talk about that. I'll skip about an hour of the film. In Karuizawa, Jiro reunites with Nahoko. And at that moment, Nahoko is painting and her easel collapses due to the strong wind. The easel collapses and the parasol is blown away. For Nahoko, Jiro is her wind. As I told you in the previous lecture, the wind in this film corresponds to adversity or tragedy. But Miyazaki also shows new opportunities created when the adversities are overcome, like the Great Kanto earthquake. Jiro is the wind for Nahoko. The strong wind knocks over the easel and blows away the parasol. As I told you in the last lecture, this easel collapsing is a sign that Nahoko is not going to live long. This encounter with Jiro will lead Nahoko to her death. The parasol blowing away is a sign of fate. But at this moment, Nahoko still doesn't realize that he is the same Jiro that she met before when he was a student. She realizes who he is when she sees him in a canteen later that night. When Nahoko realizes that it is the Jiro that she met before, her back straightens and her hair stands up. In the NHK documentary, Miyazaki mutters, "Those insensitive morons don't get it," and corrects the drawing of another animator. He says, "In real life, when people are surprised, their backs straighten and their hair stands up." You have to know these things. He says that as he draws the reunion scene, making the character behave the way he describes. And a mysterious foreigner called Castorp sits between Nahoko and Jiro. Miyazaki placed the third party, a stranger, between these two figures who are in a romantic relationship as a sign to represent their future. Jiro came here because he was ordered to take a break from work. He was very upset because his first airplane that he designed crashed. His project ended in failure. His project used a lot of money at a time when the country was desperately poor, just like Honjo said. But the project was a failure. Even Jiro is well aware that the government barely managed to scrape sufficient money together to fund the project. He can be a bit insensitive, but he's aware. He lost the drive to achieve his goal after this failure. He was devastated and didn't know why he was making airplanes in the first place. That's why he came to Karuizawa. In this scene, Miyazaki depicts Jiro's inner life. Jiro recalls his childhood memories while he's alone in his room. He's not motivated at all. This means that Honjo's character isn't needed anymore. In the early draft, Honjo and Jiro's friendship was at the center of the story. But the center gradually shifts to Jiro and Nahoko's romantic relationship. Their relationship is now at the center. It was a bold move. That's when this Castorp's role becomes bigger. Miyazaki didn't intend to make him a huge character, but it gradually became bigger and bigger. Castorp says to Jiro, "Lovely place, isn't it? Perfect place to forget." When you stop the video, you can see that Castorp looks pretty intimidating. We all forget the war with China. We forget Manchuria, League of Nations, and that we are turning against the world. He smokes and says, "Japan will explode, and so will Germany." And while Nahoko is speaking with Castorp, her tuberculosis returns. Castorp is another Caproni. He's telling Jiro to forget everything. Forget about the situation Japan is in. Forget about the League of Nations. Forget about the war with China. Just forget everything. He says, if you love this girl, you should be with her. He encourages Jiro to spend time with her and spend his life doing what you love. Afterwards, after the scene in Karuizawa, Jiro has allowed himself to completely forget all about how he blamed himself when his own project failed. He only thinks about Nahoko and planes. He eventually obeys Castorp's words. You should forget it. Focus on what's in front of you, or you'll be wasting your time because you're not able to do what you really want to do. Jiro used to have a strong sense of justice, but he starts lying to the company, saying he has to go to a memorial service so that he can see Nahoko. When his superior tells him, "Too many memorial services. How many relatives do you have?" he answers, "I have loads." He's very unapologetic. He doesn't feel guilty about dodging work anymore. That's because he listened to Castorp's advice to forget everything. By this point in his life, the young Jiro, who had a strong sense of justice, has disappeared. So, you think that Castorp is like Mephistopheles, the devil, just like Caproni. But that is not the case. Castorp is more of a prophet. He's like Yoda in Star Wars. He only predicts what is going to happen to the couple and to this country. He doesn't curse anybody. He says Japan, which was still an empire then, is not going to live long. And so is Nahoko. You should act fast and just ignore what people say. Japan will explode, so hurry up and create your plane. Nahoko is going to die, so spend more time with her. He plays the piano and sings just once and for all, and congratulates the couple. He knows that Japan is going to turn against the world, that Japan and Germany will explode, and he's encouraging Jiro to forget all that. So, Castorp is not a devil. Although you'll see a witch in this film, you'll notice that in the next scene. It's Nahoko's curse. The day after Nahoko recognizes that Jiro is the guy she met before, she casts a spell. She places the parasol and the iso at the entrance to the forest. Jiro, not knowing what this is, goes into the forest and he sees Nahoko praying, gazing at the fountain. Water is gushing out. I thought if she knew that she was going to reunite with him, she should have just waited for him. Why did she cast a spell? When Jiro sees Nahoko praying, he says, "Oh, excuse me, I didn't mean to bother you," and goes to leave, but then she says, "Don't go, I was thanking the fountain." Jiro's surprised, and then at the next moment, she approaches Jiro very slowly, saying, "I was praying that you would come here." She moves slowly from left to right while saying this line. She is almost like somebody in a horror film. This has to be intentional. It's always intentional when a character speaks while slowly approaching somebody in any kind of animation. So Miyazaki intended to make this a scary scene. But because composer Joe Hisaishi's music is so beautiful, it's hard to get Miyazaki's message. But even after she says, "I was hoping that you'd come here, you haven't changed," Jiro doesn't remember anything. He remembered Nahoko's assistant, Okinu, who was quite a beauty, but he hadn't taken any notice of Nahoko and didn't remember her at all. It all comes back to him when Nahoko tells him the whole story. Afterwards, the two start talking, but it starts to rain. While the rain falls, the two huddle under a single umbrella, and Nahoko keeps talking to Jiro. "I found out where you lived 2 days before Okinu's wedding. Okinu was so happy that she cried." I guess she did cry, but I don't think she cried because she was happy. It's a lie. If she was happy, she would have met him when she delivered his slide rule and shirt to Tokyo University 2 days before her wedding. But the reason why she didn't meet Jiro when she brought his slide rule and shirt is because she was going to get married 2 days later. She agreed to marry because she didn't think she would meet Jiro ever again. So of course she cried. Not because she was happy, but because she couldn't see Jiro. Nahoko looks very happy when she talks about this. That's because Jiro didn't remember Nahoko, but remembered Okinu instead. So it's a sort of revenge. Afterwards, Nahoko says, I got to tell Okinu. She had her second child the other day. The baby's so cute. You are looking at this woman and you're thinking, how scary a woman can be. It's a horror film, really. Nahoko is basically saying to Jiro, who remembered Okinu, that Okinu already has 2 kids, that she gave birth to her second child the other day. She sounds very innocent, but Miyazaki shows her dark side. But for us, middle-aged men, it's hard to know. You'll notice all these things that are pretty new to Miyazaki's film. when you look at it carefully. I personally feel that this is a magic rain to bring the two together. That's why the spell is broken when her father approaches her. After Nahoko finishes talking about Okinu, and the rain is not necessary anymore, it stops. On one side of a line, the ground is soaked, and on the other side, it is dry. But this can't be possible. Weather in Karuizawa can be unstable. So it is possible that one side of the road is wet, but it is impossible for the ground to be suddenly dry from a certain point after all that heavy rain. So this is one of the strange phenomena in the film. After the conversation, they turn around and Nahoko sees a rainbow. Nowadays, a rainbow is a sign of good luck. But long ago, people thought it was ominous. They used the rainbow shape to denote an evil omen. So you can see that Nahoko does indeed have a witch's magical power. It's quite scary. I try to be careful in this type of scene because I tend to overthink it. If it was only one or two things, it could be just a coincidence. Now in this scene, Nahoko hides her powerful feelings of jealousy and tries to look good in front of Jiro. This weird trick that Nahoko plays at the edge of the forest, a mysterious fountain, Nahoko approaching him slowly, that unnatural rain. I mean, there are too many strange happenings. Jiro once gave up all his dreams, lost the will to live, but then he meets Nahoko. And once again, he is inspired to design planes. His passion for designing planes comes back to life because he wants to show Nahoko the beautiful machines that he can create. At the same time, Nahoko regains her will to live. She had tuberculosis, and she was ready to embrace death. But then she meets Jiro, and she recovers her zest for living. So they inspire each other in a way. So, it's not like the reunion with Jiro, or the relationship with him hastened her death. A woman who was simply waiting to die becomes a woman who wants to live. And moreover, this love turns her into a jealous woman. But she knows that she can never show this side of her. Her true nature to Jiro, the love of her life, so she becomes a woman of contradictions. So many of you might have thought that Castorp is Mephistopheles. But Castorp is only a prophet who advises Jiro to live in the moment and stop worrying about the future. Nahoko appears innocent and unselfish on the surface, but underneath, she has a strong appetite for life and all the attributes of a witch. Whereas Jiro makes a bargain with the devil and sells his soul. I'll talk about this bargain in the next chapter. I'll talk a bit more. Sorry. Meanwhile, Jiro starts a relationship with Nahoko, but her tuberculosis worsens. And Nahoko voluntarily goes to a sanatorium on the plateau. But Jiro doesn't go and see her. That's because the project for his new plane has already started, and he doesn't have the time. But he is engrossed in debate with his colleagues every night. He's not doing this just for fun. He's doing it because it's part of his job to inspire all the workers in the project. He thought it was his duty, and he rarely visits Nahoko's sanatorium. I talked about Jiro's letter to Nahoko a few years ago. He asks how she's feeling in his first two lines. But other than that, he only talks about his work. Nahoko is bored in the sanatorium. It says clearly that she's bored in the original draft, and then she sees a snowflake, Kazabana. Kazabana, which literally means windflower, is a snowflake that comes from the mountains. It's early for snow, but snow from the mountains travels on the wind. It's a sign that snow will fall before long. At this moment, she knows that she's soon going to die. Snow will fall soon. Once the snow starts to fall, the sanatorium will be isolated. She can't go out, and Jiro can't come to see her either. She knows that she won't live to see the spring. She feels that she must get out of there before the snow falls, or else she will never see Jiro again. The snowflake makes Nahoko realize that her time is limited. Nahoko escapes from the sanatorium. The snow starts to fall the day after she runs away. So it was a close call. She doesn't want to die waiting for him. She wants to see him before she dies. Jiro gets a call from Nahoko's family that she has escaped, and he rushes to the station. They reunite once again at the station. In the NHK documentary called 1,000 Days of the Wind Rises, we see Miyazaki struggling to draw the storyboard. He's cursing and correcting all the drawings done by other animators. He looks at the drawing of Jiro from behind when he's waiting for Nahoko and says, "What is this? This says nothing." I guess Miyazaki had something specific in his mind about Jiro's back. That's why he was furious and had to correct the drawing. And the two meet at the station. He was going to encourage Nahoko as soon as they met at the station and say, "Let's go back to the sanatorium. You can do this. Let's cure the disease," which is understandable. But once he meets her, he doesn't want to let her go. He says to her, "Don't go." Nahoko is sensible and says, "I was going to go back after I saw you." But Jiro in the frame before this says, "Don't go back," once again. It says, because it was unexpected, although she wanted him to say that, she looks at him in surprise. Nahoko's face lights up with joy in the storyboard. Jiro says to her, "Let's live here together." Because she didn't expect this to happen, she is filled with joy and her face brightens up. People around her would always tell her to get better. They would say, "Get better and go on living," because they cared about her. Tuberculosis is very infectious, and the death rate is high. That's what people thought back then. But for Nahoko, getting better means giving up living. It means living confined in a lonely place. So the people who tell her to get better care about her, but don't understand her. Jiro was the first to tell her, "You don't have to get better." He is essentially saying to her, "You don't have to get cured. I don't mind getting infected. Let's die together." This story is, in a way, similar to No Longer Human by Osamu Tezuka. That novel is about a guy who couldn't die together with his lover. They planned a double suicide. It is a story about a guy who lives with shame because the woman dies before him. And The Wind Rises is also a story about an airplane designer who is supposed to die with the love of his life but fails. He must go on living and endure the shame afterwards. If you realize that this is a story about a double suicide, you'll understand this tobacco scene. The two go to Kurokawa's house and have a private wedding. That night, Nahoko says to Jiro, "Come here." When Jiro hesitates, she cuts in and says, "Come here," again, lifting the futon. She says, "Come here" twice in this scene, and this is linked to the last scene. So remember that. Why does she say, "Come here" twice? on the storyboard, you can see the connections between this and the last scene. They tie the knot, but Jiro comes home late every night, and at some point, he starts working at home. Before that, no matter how busy he was, he never worked at home. But in order to spend more time with Nahoko, he has no choice. Nahoko in bed asks Jiro who is working beside her to hold her hand. Jiro takes her hand in his left hand and keeps tapping the calculator with his right. He is excited and says, "I think it's going to work out. I can make it 20 grams lighter." He's struggling with his work at the company, but when he works at home holding her hand, everything goes well. When I saw the scene where Jiro is smoking while working, I thought he was such a selfish guy. I thought, doesn't he know that he's shortening Nahoko's life? But I was wrong. When Jiro says, "I want to smoke, will you release my hand?" she says no, which is unusual for her. She never refuses what Jiro wants. So Jiro smokes with one hand. Jiro smokes when his work is going well. It is a sign that his work is on track. His brain becomes more active when the work is going smoothly. That's why he starts to smoke. They're creating their own plane together, holding each other's hands. Nahoko's blood flows through Jiro's body and it eventually breathes new life into the Kyushi single-seater fighter plane. Nahoko doesn't want anybody to help her live. That's not what she wants. She wants to be the one to help. She wants to take care of Jiro. She wants to help him create planes. But Jiro doesn't realize her intentions. So it is similar to the story of Twilight Crane. She is like the crane weaving the fabric with her own feathers and telling the old couple never to enter her room. She weaves her own life. That's why she doesn't let go of his hand. That's because she knows that her life is being used to create the Zero Fighter planes. That is the only way she can share life with this man who knows nothing but planes. Of course, he can always compliment her and say she's beautiful, but she's more than that. She's an active person. She knows that to be part of this man's life, she has no choice but to help him make Zero Fighter planes. If Nahoko didn't escape the sanatorium, the Zero Fighter planes would never have been completed. There's a scene where Jiro says, "I owe it all to you." I thought first that he was thanking her for supporting him, but this is actually a dark fantasy. As if they were in the demon world, her pulse flows through Jiro's body and they create a plane together, the fruit of their love. But eventually, this Zero Fighter plane destroys Japan. The structure of the story is pretty extreme. I divided the film into blocks. Then I gradually began to realize that there was a connection between each block and the next. They're all connected. Naoko never consults Jiro about what to do. "I am going to the sanatorium. I am escaping the sanatorium. I am going back to the sanatorium once my job is done." She never consults with Jiro about her decisions. She decides on her own. She's very independent. She decides to stay beside him until the plane is completed. And as soon as her job is done, she goes back to the sanatorium because there's nothing else to do. Kurokawa's wife says she only wanted to show her beautiful side, but she doesn't understand Nahoko fully. She saw half of Nahoko, but the other half of Nahoko says, I simply have nothing more to do. She wanted to be with Jiro because she wanted to help, not just because she loved Jiro. She has guts and she's extremely active, just like all the other heroines in Miyazaki films. Miyazaki is objecting to Isao Takahata's claim that we no longer need fantasies. This is a dark fantasy. He's saying that reality is the fantasy. A poor country yearning for planes. A woman sacrificing her life for her husband. If this isn't fantasy, what is? This is his powerful antithesis against Takahata's thesis. After Jiro completes his plane, Nahoko leaves him. Kurokawa's wife has a woman's view, but I think Nahoko is a very strong person. Jiro remembered Okinu, who he met during the Great Kanto earthquake. That's because she was pretty. Nahoko knows that Jiro didn't remember her because she wasn't pretty enough. But now, because Jiro tells her that she is pretty, she concludes that he'll remember her even if she goes back to the sanatorium. That's why she goes back. Jiro doesn't know that Nahoko has left him while he's experimenting with his plane. This is the scene where the single-seater fighter plane flies. It executes the amazing Immelman turn. The plane makes a circle while rotating. It flies like this. It gains altitude at full speed, but it flips and flies upside down and comes back around while losing altitude. It twists and circles forward while rising. Oh my god! Someone fell out of the cockpit. I'll pick him up later. The plane never loses speed during this exercise. When a plane gains altitude, twists, and makes a circle, it would have been natural for it to lose speed back then. So this is a high-performance plane. It can turn while maintaining dynamic lift. It somersaults. And it's not even a biplane. It's a monoplane. Afterwards, the wind blows and Jiro senses something strange. Miyazaki didn't want anything too dramatic. Miyazaki once criticized Osamu Tezuka. Miyazaki didn't like the fact that Tezuka kills off his characters just to make the audience cry. Tezuka did this to evoke emotions in the audience, but Miyazaki didn't like that. So, he didn't want Jiro to be absent from Nahoko's deathbed. He didn't want Jiro to rush home and say, the plane is finished, only to find out that she's already dead. Miyazaki wanted to avoid that. That's why Nahoko leaves Jiro. Nobody knows whether they will see each other again. Nobody knows whether Nahoko dies or not. It's a story about the death of Nahoko and Japan. Jiro loved both of them because of their beauty. He creates Zero Fighter planes and tries so hard to keep Japan alive, but he fails. He fails to save Japan. He fails to save everything that was beautiful to him. In the opening scene, Jiro tries to save the girls in the spinning mill. He tries to save the beautiful landscape of the rice paddies from the attack of the German airship, but he fails miserably. So this opening sequence is a summary of the whole story. In the first half, this is actually the second half because the lecture before was the first. I talked for an hour and 10 minutes, so I'll say the rest in the limited part. But let's do the questionnaire first. The second half is a continuation of this one. I'll go a bit faster in the limited part, and I'll talk about Germany. Okay. In the next... Anyway, let's just see the result. Thank you! Next Nico Nico Live is on the last Sunday. Like I said at the end of March, there will be no more Nico Nico Live on the last Sunday of the month. On April 23rd, we'll talk about Gundam from 8 p.m. And on May 5th... Oh yes, this is going to be our last Otaking seminar of the Heisei era. Although we still have Gundam left, our first lecture of Reiwa era, we'll talk about Moomin. I wanted to talk about Moomin for a long time, so I'd like to analyze Moomin in my own way. Okay, now, that was long, wasn't it? The limited part is going to be more nerdy, but stay tuned. Okay, now let's switch.
Thank you for watching until the end. I am the most famous Otaku King in Japan, Otaking Toshio Okada. I started planning to talk overseas about animations and movies popular in Japan in English. Before long, I'm planning to add English subtitles to movie talking in Japanese, so please look forward to it. If you ask a question in this comment field of this video, maybe I will talk about comments as a theme. We welcome the people who are interested in the forefront of Japanese otaku culture, and those who want to hear stories of interesting animations and movies. So please subscribe our channel. If there is good relation, I will get better and I will do my best. Thanks.